a brooch buried in bone dust, a smear of soot that whispers across centuries, and a silence so deep, even the dead seemed afraid to break it. This is a tale where art conceals motive, and love is the most deceptive forgery of all. A locked truth waits to be revealed, layer by chilling layer. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on one of those grey London mornings in early March, when the fog seems not so much to hang in the air as to seep into the walls, that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street. The windows were clouded over, the fire had burned low, and Holmes, with chin resting on steepled fingers, stared intently at the barometer on the mantelpiece as if it alone held the key to some vast and unsolvable cosmic riddle. He had not spoken a word in over an hour. I had grown so accustomed to his moods that I knew better than to intrude with idle chatter. Yet there was something in his stillness, a tension, a kind of coiled expectancy that struck me as unusually pronounced. I had just opened my mouth to speak when a sharp rap at the door silenced both my thought and the room. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later with a card upon a tray and a raised eyebrow that suggested curiosity she dared not voice aloud. Holmes took the card without glancing at it, then said simply, "Show him in." A man stepped across the threshold, tall, narrow-shouldered, wrapped in a charcoal overcoat of fine cut, with a collar drawn high and gloves conspicuously absent. His eyes, pale and clear, swept the room with the nervous precision of one entering enemy territory. "I am in urgent need of your expertise, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "May I speak freely?" "You may," Holmes replied. "Dr. Watson is not only my confidant, but often the keener observer when it comes to matters of the human soul." The man hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. "Very well. My name is Mr. Ellery." He sat, but not easily. His gaze flitted from Holmes to the clock, then to the coals, and finally back again, as if calculating how many truths might safely be spoken before the hour was done. "You have not come far," Holmes said, eyeing the man's cuffs, which bore the faint pink residue of London's fog-stained bricks. "And yet, judging by the way you clenched your right hand when seated, you are no stranger to a riding crop. Military, cavalry, most likely." Ellery stiffened. "As for the gloves you do not wear," Holmes continued, "they are in your pocket, damp from last night's rain, proof enough that your urgency did not begin this morning." "Your reputation, Mr. Holmes," Ellery said quietly, "is clearly deserved." "It concerns Barcombe Hall," Ellery began, "an estate near Sussex, inherited through my mother's side. There was a renovation underway last week, clearing an old wine cellar sealed since my grandfather's time." He paused. "Behind the false wall they found skeletons, 3, according to the constabulary, deserters from the Napoleonic Wars, or so they claim. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, I saw 4. "4?" I repeated, leaning forward. "Yes, one of them, the 4th, was no century-old corpse. Its clothing was modern. The face, though long dead, was unmistakably recent." He exhaled shakily. "Yet the police said I was mistaken, that I imagined it." I turned to Holmes, expecting incredulity or skepticism. Instead, I found him still as a cat before the pounce, his eyes narrowed with interest, almost delight. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers once again. "The 4th," he said, half to himself, half to us, "is always the one they forget." And in that moment, I knew our morning fog had just thickened into mystery. "My name," the man said at last, drawing in a breath as if resigning himself to some internal reckoning, "is not Ellery." Holmes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I am Sir Percival Maddock, the current holder of Barcombe Hall in Sussex." I blinked in surprise. The Maddocks were an old and respected family, their name whispered in the better clubs of Pall Mall. with the kind of regard reserved for landed men with clean reputations and messy inheritances. And this matter, he continued, fingers tightening on the arms of the chair, concerns not merely the discovery of the dead, but the failure of the living to reckon with them. Holmes gave a faint nod. Go on, Sir Percival. The fog has lifted somewhat. The baronet glanced once more at the hearth before beginning the tale that would lead us from dust to dread. There's a disused wine cellar beneath the east wing, Sir Percival began. It was sealed by my grandfather in 1883, after an incident I was always told involved flooding from a burst pipe. I took little notice of it until last week, when a workman repairing the lower foundations noticed a hollow-sounding stretch of stone. He paused, as though seeing it again. They brought me down at once. The wall came apart more easily than expected, and behind it, God help me, were the remains of 3 men, or so the constables reported. You disagree? Holmes asked, his eyes now alight with that curious, dispassionate intensity I'd come to associate with grave matters. I do, said Sir Percival, his voice steady. I saw 4 bodies. I counted them. One was slumped near the edge. Not skeletal, but recent. Still clad in what looked like a maid's uniform. Yet when I returned with the sergeant, it was gone. He exhaled deeply. They think I imagined it. Or worse, that I lied. I know what I saw, Sir Percival repeated, almost in defiance of himself. The girl, if that's what she was, had not decayed like the others. Her features were still discernible, her limbs not yet withered to bone. I even recall the colour of her dress. Faded blue with a pale apron, the type our maids once wore. Holmes had leaned back, fingers tapping the tips together. And no one else witnessed this? They were several paces behind me. It was dark, and I had the lantern. A convenient condition, Holmes murmured. I realise how it sounds. But there are circumstances. He hesitated. The estate has known its share of secrets. My grandfather was a stern man, the kind who believed that family honour could excuse almost any cruelty, provided it was done out of sight. Holmes said nothing, but the gleam in his eye had sharpened. There have been other oddities, Sir Percival admitted. Only last month, one of the girls, Lottie, vanished from the estate. A quiet, capable maid. No quarrels, no warnings. She simply failed to appear for her duties one morning, and we never saw her again. Curious, I said. Was it reported? Of course. But with no sign of struggle and no personal effects missing, the constable treated it as a runaway case. Nothing came of it. He leaned forward while lowering his voice. That same week, an old ledger from the library disappeared. It was a sealed record book from 1883, my grandfather's personal accounts. And then came the sounds. Sounds? Holmes prompted. At night, low scratching noises from behind walls. A door found ajar in the west corridor that no one remembered opening. I dismiss it as the fancies of a creaking house, if not for the timing. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. No humour in it this time. You spent time in Ceylon, Holmes said suddenly. Sir Percival blinked. I did. Years ago. How could you possibly? The ink on your right thumb, Holmes explained. A common brand used exclusively in southern trading offices. It leaves a faint residue, distinguishable only under certain lamplight. And the wrist, he added. You favour your left hand unconsciously. The right bears a restricted range of motion, typical of a sabre fracture badly healed. Colonial cavalry. Am I correct? Sir Percival gave a strained smile. I am beginning to see what they mean about you. Regrettably, Holmes replied, most people only begin to see once it is too late. Holmes rose and moved to the shelves with sudden purpose, extracting a thin volume of Sussex architecture and handing it to me with his usual wordless precision. Page 63, he said. You'll find Barkham's original cellar design recorded there. Compare it with the current floor plan. Mark Any deviation, I took it without question, already scanning for annotations. In the meantime, Holmes sat at the desk and began writing, not with his usual flamboyant scrawl, but with a measured, official hand. I knew that tone of posture well. It was the kind he reserved for communications that stirred even the civil servants from their brandy. "To the Home Office?" I asked. He nodded. "If the dead are inconvenient, then the living must be made more so. Let us ensure Barcombe's history does not go quietly." Sir Percival had departed not long after, leaving behind a silence weighted with implication. Holmes stood again by the hearth, his gaze not on the fire, but on the far wall, as if searching for cracks no eye could yet see. "You believe him?" I said finally. "I believe he saw something," Holmes replied. "The mind plays tricks, but so does guilt, especially inherited guilt." He turned, slowly. "But consider, Watson, 3 bodies from a war long past, sealed behind a false wall for over 4 decades. That alone would earn a footnote in the archives. But if he's correct, if there was a 4th, recent, and then removed." I waited. Holmes lifted his violin from the case, and as he drew the bow slowly across the strings, he said, "One does not hide 4 bodies unless one fears the 5th. And with that, the notes began, low, searching, full of things unsaid. It was 2 days later that Holmes and I departed by train for Sussex, the fog of London giving way to a more open bleakness that seemed to stretch over the countryside like an unspoken warning. Barcombe Hall, when at last it came into view, did not disappoint my expectations. It stood at the edge of a sloping hill, stern and weather-beaten, with ivy clawing up the stone as if trying to forget what lay beneath it. Holmes surveyed the grounds in silence, his gaze moving not toward the sweeping facade or stately windows, but to the crumbling east wing, where the cellar in question lay hidden behind a generation of neglect. The staff greeted us with that strained politeness which often masks fear, and I could not help but notice the way their eyes lingered, not on Holmes, but on the very soil beneath our feet. The cellar was narrow and low-roofed, the kind that inspired unease in even the most rational mind. The false wall had already been breached, revealing behind it 3 skeletal forms, laid in a careless tangle that spoke not of burial but of hurried concealment. Holmes crouched low, his fingers brushing the edge of the stone, and then the ground beneath. He took in the decay, the position of the bones, the angle of the limbs. "Curious," he murmured, lifting one foot in particular. "Note the heel, still partially intact. And the leather?" I bent to look and found it remarkably well preserved. "Modern stitching," Holmes added, "and applied lime only on this one. The others bear no such treatment." "You mean?" "I mean," Holmes said quietly, "that someone tried to accelerate the decomposition of this body while hiding it among the others. A fraud within a fraud, Watson. That is always worth attending to." We moved to the far end of the chamber, where a small wall-mounted clock, its face shattered and hands still, hung askew on a rusted nail. Holmes studied it briefly, then turned his attention to a candlestick resting beneath it, its melted wax frozen in an awkward spill down the shelf. He held a match to the wax, sniffed the faint scent, and then examined the soot gathered on the face of the clock. 17 minutes past 2, he said, with maddening calm. I blinked. "That's when it stopped?" "No," Holmes replied. "That's when someone stopped it." He tapped the wax with a fingernail. "Still soft enough to retain heat. Someone lit this candle days ago, not years. And they did so to obscure the face of the clock while they tampered with it. We have not merely murder here, Watson. We have rehearsal. The library, though spacious, had a curious air of neglect. Dust hung in the air like judgment, and the scent of old paper mingled with mildew and secrets. Holmes moved toward a tall set of shelves with a precision I had long since ceased questioning. "This is the ledger room, yes?" he asked. Sir Percival, who had joined us by then, nodded. The family account books. I kept them intact out of tradition, not interest. Holmes slid his fingers along the shelf edges, paused, then pointed. One book, removed and replaced recently. See here. The dust layer is intact except for the half ring, and the shelf bears the imprint of where the volume once sat, but now sits a centimetre to the right. He then crouched and examined the floorboards. Soft mud. Footprints consistent with a woman's heel. Small, narrow, but deliberate. Sir Percival frowned. Lottie? Possibly, Holmes said. Or someone clever enough to wear her shoes. In either case, the book was of interest. The question is, to whom? While Holmes continued his quiet interrogation of the house's walls, I sought out the ancient housekeeper, Mrs. Dandridge. A small, sharp-eyed woman whose joints cracked with every movement, and whose speech came in whispers, as though the house itself might listen. "It's not for me to say," she murmured. When I inquired about Lottie, she was a good girl, quiet, kept to herself, but there was fear in her near the end. "Fear?" I prompted. "She said someone was watching the house," Mrs. Dandridge said. "Out by the orchard, late in the evenings. Thought I didn't see, but I did. A tall fellow with a limp. Never came close. Just stared." "And when Lottie vanished?" "Left no note. Took nothing. Just gone." I leaned forward. "And did you tell Sir Percival?" Her eyes narrowed. "I did. And he told me to lock the windows. That was all." Outside, I heard Holmes pacing the hall with restless precision, as though his mind had already begun to assemble the bones of a darker history than Barcombe Hall dared admit. Later that afternoon, I found Holmes once more in the library, crouched before the ledger shelf with the same expression he reserved for violin strings ever so slightly out of tune. "Someone removed the ledger," he said without looking up, "and then, oddly, replaced it." "But why return it?" I asked. "Surely the contents were the goal." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, brushing his fingers across the wood. "But observe here. There is a rectangular shadow where dust has not settled evenly. And here, the faint drag of a fingernail on the lower edge, too recent to be mistaken. The book was pulled, examined, and, crucially, returned in haste." He rose, dusting his knees. "It suggests a very particular breed of thief. Not one who steals to keep, but one who steals to learn. You believe someone was searching for something inside?" "Not only that, my dear Watson," he said, moving toward the window, "but that they feared what they might find. When knowledge itself is more dangerous than possession, one can be certain that the past has not yet finished speaking." That evening, as the wind swept against the leaded panes and a modest fire crackled in the drawing-room hearth, Sir Percival joined us for tea. He looked wearier than before, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, and his voice strained as he recounted the latest correspondence from his solicitor. Yet something in his manner had begun to trouble me. He spoke of the missing maid, the cellar, and the family accounts with a curious detachment, too polished, too composed. "There are families," I said to Holmes later, as Sir Percival excused himself, "in which silence becomes hereditary." Holmes gave a thin smile. "A poetic notion, Watson, and not entirely inaccurate. You think he knows?" "I think," Holmes said, sipping his tea, "that Sir Percival Maddock knows precisely what was sealed within that wall. I also think he has spent years convincing himself it was best left so. But guilt," he added, setting down his cup, "is rarely content with such arrangements. It always scratches until heard." Night at Barcombe Hall brought with it a stillness that felt less like peace and more like breath held too long. Holmes paced the corridor with deliberate steps, pausing at intervals to tap the floorboards, inspect hinges, and occasionally simply to listen. I followed in silence, not wishing to disturb whatever string of thoughts coiled within his mind. At one point, he stopped before the sealed cellar door, fingers resting lightly on the handle, though he made no move to open it. "This house speaks in whispers," he said quietly. "Do you mean the servants?" I asked. "I mean the structure," he replied. "The drafts, the shifting wood, the irregularities in echo. Buildings age like men, Watson, by their groans, not their appearances." He turned to me, brow furrowed in something close to contemplation. "There's something behind that wall still unsaid, not merely a body, something heavier. And what do we do?" I asked. He tapped the door once, gently. "We wait. The dead are patient, but not endlessly so." And with that, we returned to our rooms, the silence following us like a fourth presence down the hall. It was Holmes' habit, when faced with human puzzles, to treat architecture and furniture as if they too possessed motives to deceive. On the morning following our cellar inspection, he lingered in the drawing room longer than one might deem polite, inspecting the portraits that lined the walls like a family of mute witnesses. "This one," he murmured, motioning toward a gilt-framed painting of some unsmiling ancestor, "rings hollow." Before I could inquire, he had removed it cleanly from the wall. Behind it lay another canvas, dusty, unframed, and fixed to the plaster by crude nails and time. He studied it for a long moment before speaking. "A servant," I offered. "Barcombe colours. Yes, but not just any servant." Holmes' eyes had narrowed. "Note the quality of the brushwork, the expense of the oils. This was not painted for sentiment." The girl's expression was solemn, her dark eyes intelligent, hauntingly so. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I should like you to visit Mycroft. Ask him what he knows of Imogen Maddock. I suspect this canvas has spoken her name without sound." Holmes' request, as ever, was more command than suggestion, and so I found myself that same evening crossing Pall Mall beneath a bruised sky, bound for the austere comfort of the Diogenes Club. Mycroft Holmes received me with his usual blend of disinterest and omniscience. "Imogen Maddock," he repeated, as if tasting a bitter draught. "Now there's a name not spoken in polite society since Gladstone last wore black." "She lived here?" I asked. "Briefly," he replied. "Came to London in '83 under the pretext of schooling. Eloped with a man deemed inappropriate by her family, an art dealer, if memory serves. Disappeared shortly after. The Maddocks declared her dead in spirit and made certain society did the same." "And the man?" I asked. "Julian Raynaud, Parisian, too clever with his hands, if you understand me. Dabbled in forgery, restoration, anything that required charm and discretion. A dangerous combination." "And you believe the family had no hand in her disappearance?" Mycroft gave a faint smile. "Dr. Watson, the aristocracy rarely stains its hands, but it does, on occasion, bury them." I returned to Barcombe with a chill not born of weather and a name that refused to leave my thoughts. The next morning, Holmes led me back down to the cellar, torch in hand, his eyes fixed on a particular spot beside the disturbed wall where the lime had been most heavily scattered. "There's something here," he said quietly. "I smelled it yesterday, metal and rose oil." He dropped to one knee and with the edge of a trowel gently scraped away a layer of debris. Within seconds something glinted. He drew it out carefully. A brooch, encrusted with grime but unmistakably ornate. A silver filigree oval surrounding a miniature portrait of a woman no longer recognizable, though her gown bore the faded trace of Barcombe livery blue. Holmes wiped it clean with his handkerchief, then nodded. "Look closely, Watson." I did. The brooch was dated on the back, April 1883. "The same year Imogen vanished," I said. "The same year the cellar was sealed," he added. Holmes turned it over once more and examined the clasp. Parisian craftsmanship. This was not mass-made. It was a gift, likely from Raynaud himself. "Then she was here," I murmured. "She was more than here," Holmes replied grimly. "She was placed here, alongside 3 men who had no reason to lie beside her in death. That afternoon, under Holmes' instruction, The local magistrate granted permission for a more formal inspection of the remains. Though I lacked Holmes' grim enthusiasm for such tasks, I assisted where needed. One skeleton, partially preserved, draped in tattered fabric, had clearly been mistaken for modern. Holmes moved about it like a physician diagnosing an old wound. The skin, what little remains, is parchment thin, yet not recent. He pointed to the teeth. Minimal wear. This was a young woman, well fed. No evidence of industrial labour. The hair, dark, fine. And look here. He held up a delicate bone, its size and shape consistent with a woman's wrist. Around it clung a threadbare remnant of lace cuff, blue, just as Sir Percival described. She died young, I said. She died young, and she died alone, though someone placed her among others to suggest otherwise. Holmes paused. That someone knew the cellar would one day be uncovered and meant to bury truth beneath misdirection. You mean, I said slowly, Imogen wasn't murdered with the others? She wasn't murdered with them, Holmes replied. She was hidden among them. And that, Watson, is the more elegant crime. We were returning from the stables when Holmes paused mid-stride, his gaze arrested by something half buried in the frost-hardened path near the cellar's storm entrance. He knelt without comment and lifted a small dark object between thumb and forefinger. A button, I observed, peering over his shoulder. Indeed, Holmes murmured, holding it up to the light. Silk-covered, hand-stitched, and, observe the thread, double-twisted, dyed with saffron mordant. He smiled faintly. Parisian work, Watson. Mid-tier tailoring, likely from Rue des Petits Champs. They use this thread exclusively for stage costumes and replica garments. A forgery of clothing? I asked, puzzled. Or the clothing of a forger, Holmes replied, rising to his feet. Julien Reynaud. The name rang faintly familiar. A Frenchman of adaptable morals, Holmes continued, paints the past for profit, recently implicated in the vanishing of several minor artworks from estates near Sussex. And what would such a man want with a dead girl's brooch? I asked. Holmes arched a brow. Or the ledger that concealed the deed. He brushed the dirt from his fingers. Reynaud is not here for vengeance, Watson. He is here for secrets, and someone has convinced him that Barcombe hides a valuable one. It was just after supper that Mrs. Dandridge reappeared, wringing her hands and casting nervous glances toward the rear windows. Holmes invited her to speak plainly, and after some coaxing from me, she did. "He's back, sir," she whispered. "Same as before. Out by the orchard, standing still as a fence post and just as pale. Tall fellow. Has a limp. Right side drags behind the left." Holmes did not look surprised. "What was he doing?" "Nothing, sir. Just watching the house. Same as when Miss Lottie vanished." Her voice dropped. Only this time, he was closer. Holmes tapped his fingers against the chair arm. Any facial features? Couldn't say. He wore a scarf about the neck and his hat brim pulled low. But the walk, foreign, stiff. Not local born, I'd wager. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then nodded once. "Thank you, Mrs. Dandridge. You've been most helpful." When she had gone, I asked, "Do you believe it's Reynaud?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that the man who forges paintings is also forging a trail, and he has not yet finished his signature." That night, Holmes paced the length of the hall with that particular rhythm I had come to associate with internal combustion. I followed him at a distance until, without turning, he said, "The ledger was not taken to destroy. It was taken to translate." "To translate?" I echoed, puzzled. "Indeed. You recall the page missing. It wasn't torn in anger. It was removed with care. Someone read something in that ledger they weren't meant to understand, and they copied it. And who would know how?" I pressed. He stopped beside the cellar door, fingers grazing the frame. A man like Reynaud. Someone trained to find meaning in shadow and ink. I frowned. "So what do we do now?" Holmes tilted his head toward the floor. "We let the cellar speak, Watson." He turned away and began to walk again. "Speak? Holmes, it's a room of stone and damp." He smiled faintly. "Only to the untrained ear. To others, like Reynaud, like myself, it is a confessional chamber built in dust and lime." Then, in the darkness, he added quietly, "The cellar tells stories to those who know how to listen." I confess I felt unsettled that evening, not merely by the house, but by Holmes himself. There was a light in his eye, a restlessness in his posture that bordered on delight. And though I admired his brilliance, there were moments, rare ones, when I wondered what it cost him to remain so thoroughly unfeeling. "You enjoy this," I said abruptly. "The puzzle, the concealment, the dance around other people's pain." Holmes looked up from the notes he was arranging on the parlour desk. "Do you take me for a sadist, Watson?" "I take you," I said, "for a man who sometimes forgets the dead were once breathing." He regarded me for a long moment, then said, not unkindly, "And I take you for a man who forgets that sentiment is not a substitute for clarity." I said nothing. Holmes folded his hands. "Justice, as we know it, is often an afterthought. Truth is the harder pursuit. And truth, my dear Watson, is rarely sentimental." He turned back to his papers, and I remained in my chair, wondering whether it was Holmes I envied or pitied. When Holmes suggested we create a forgery to catch a forger, I initially mistook him for speaking metaphorically. He was not. "An auction, Watson," he said, sorting through dusty boxes in the attic of Barcombe Hall, "of rediscovered Maddock heirlooms. A modest notice to the London circles should suffice." "But what heirlooms?" I asked, bewildered. "None, of course. The invitation is the artifact. Reynaud cannot resist the scent of provenance. It is his currency, and like all good counterfeiters, he must examine the print before believing the ink. And so it was done. An elegantly worded letter bearing Sir Percival's seal was dispatched through a subtle channel of dealers, collectors, and quietly indiscreet antiquarians. It announced the upcoming sale of a private collection featuring family paintings, documents, and a supposedly restored ledger dating back to the year 1883. Holmes reviewed the wording with surgical precision. "Note the language, recently uncovered and sealed within the estate cellar." He looked up. "That should do it." "Do what?" "Offer him something he cannot resist." Holmes folded the paper and sealed the envelope with wax. "We do not always chase foxes, Watson. Sometimes we whistle and wait." 2 nights later, beneath Barcombe Hall's crumbling east wing, we waited. Holmes, Lestrade and I had taken up our positions in the cellar, concealed behind a stack of broken wine crates and cloaked in darkness. The dust choked our lungs, the damp crept into our bones, and time ticked with agonizing slowness. "Any wagers he comes?" Lestrade muttered beside me. "If Holmes says he will," I whispered. "Then he will." Holmes, naturally, made no reply. His gaze was fixed on the far door, the very one that led in from the orchard path. He held no weapon, only a pocket watch and a thin smile. His preferred armaments in matters of calculated exposure. The trap was simple. Word of the auction would draw Reynaud back to the scene of his original intrusion. The cellar was to serve as both the crime scene and the stage. "Do you hear that?" Holmes asked suddenly. I strained my ears. At first, nothing. Then, barely perceptible, the soft crunch of gravel beneath a hesitant step. Another followed. Then silence. Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and perfectly still. "Gentlemen, we are about to receive our guest. Let the dead listen. They may recognize their visitor." The door creaked open with a slow groan, as though reluctant to admit what came next. By the thin beam of moonlight, we saw him, Julian Reynaud, just as Holmes had described him to me. A lean figure clad in a long coat too elegant for a thief, with a gait that favoured the left leg and a slight tilt to the head, as if permanently listening for betrayal. But he was not alone. A smaller figure followed close behind, cloaked, head lowered. At first I took her for an accomplice, an anonymous assistant in some Parisian scheme. Then she stepped into the shaft of moonlight. "Lottie," I breathed. Holmes did not move, but I saw the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth. The girl said nothing. Her face was pale, but her steps followed Renaud without resistance. There was no fear in her expression, only confusion, like someone who had followed a path too far to turn back, and now feared both direction and return. Renaud knelt at the false wall and began tapping the stone, listening as if it would speak his name. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Let us allow him to complete his trespass. The moment of revelation must never be rushed." When Holmes stepped into the light, it was like the curtain falling on a well-rehearsed play. Renaud froze mid-motion, one hand still resting on the chisel he had brought to pry the ledger from its hiding place. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Renaud," Holmes said smoothly. "You've travelled far for something you already stole once." Renaud rose slowly, expression unreadable. "You're not the constable." "No," Holmes replied. "I am worse." Lestrade emerged behind him, revolver drawn. I remained fixed on Lottie, who stood like a shadow just beyond the moment, her face pale as the cellar wall. "Lottie," I said gently, "do you know why he brought you here?" She blinked at me, then at Renaud. He said it was just books, that we'd found what he was looking for, that it had to be checked again." Her voice trembled. "I thought it was for paintings, not graves." Holmes gave a small nod. "You were misled. That is forgivable. He, on the other hand..." But Renaud interrupted, his voice bitter. "You think me the villain, Monsieur Holmes? Then you do not know your English baronet. It was not I who sealed a girl in lime." Holmes stepped closer. "And how do you know that?" Renaud's eyes burned. "Because I read her letters, the ones your noble Sir Percival hid. I know how she died, and I know who killed her." We all stood silent in the stillness that followed, the weight of accusation thick as the dust beneath our boots. The ledger was not ornate, a narrow, moth-eaten volume with frayed leather binding and the faintest traces of soot along the edge, as if it had once escaped fire and now bore the mark of near destruction. Renaud lifted it with trembling hands. "Here," he hissed. "Here is the proof you buried." Sir Percival, summoned under Lestrade's instruction, stood at the threshold with hands clasped behind his back, the picture of noble irritation. But the colour had drained from his cheeks when he beheld the ledger in Renaud's grasp. "Your accusations are unseemly," the baronet said coldly. "Whatever that is, it was taken under criminal pretence." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then you admit its authenticity?" Renaud, flushed with rage, opened the volume. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded letter, brittle with age. Holmes took it gently and offered it to me. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a young woman, fluid and impassioned. She spoke of love, secrecy, and a promise to meet, signed simply, Imogen. "She believed you would marry her," Renaud said, advancing now. "She thought your honour would win over your title, but you chose reputation." "Baseless slander," Percival barked. "Is it?" Renaud reached into his coat and produced a small pistol. "Then why was she found beneath your cellar, sealed with lime and silence?" Lestrade moved at once, but Holmes's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Put it down, Renaud. Imogen sought love, not vengeance." There was a long silence. Then Renaud's arm fell. The weapon clattered to the ground. "I did not kill her," he said brokenly, "but I let her die." For a moment, none of us spoke. Lestrade stooped to retrieve the pistol, while Renaud stood as if his own confession had emptied him. Sir Percival, however, made a quiet motion that did not escape Holmes. "Stop him," Holmes said, almost lazily, but it was too late. with unexpected agility for a man of his years. Sir Percival turned and darted from the cellar, ascending the narrow staircase that led to the eastern wing. I pursued instinctively, but Holmes caught my sleeve. "No need for heroics, Watson. He won't go far." The hall above echoed with his steps, the erratic thunder of a man who had spent years walking upon carpets and now fled for his soul across stone. We emerged into the foyer to find the great door ajar and the night air trembling with movement. By the time we reached the front terrace, Sir Percival had nearly reached the hedge gate, but two uniformed figures stepped from the shadows with lanterns raised. The baronet skidded to a halt, eyes wild, then sagged as though his spine had finally given up its lie. Inspector Lestrade arrived behind us, panting. "Well," he said. "He ran." "He ran," Holmes agreed. "But I dare say he knew we'd be waiting. Men like Sir Percival have always preferred performance to accountability." Lestrade looked to the gate. "Will they hold him?" "He's an aristocrat accused of burying a lover under his own house," Holmes said dryly. "He will not vanish. Scandal has a leash longer than any man's conscience." I turned to Holmes. "And justice?" He did not reply. Dawn broke over Barkham Hall with the quiet dignity of judgment. Two carriages stood at the end of the gravel lane, one for Sir Percival Maddock, who sat stiffly within, silent and bloodless, the other for Julian Raynaud, whose head rested against the window pane, eyes closed, lips moving with words we could not hear. Lestrade managed the formalities with brisk authority. "Forgery, trespass, concealment, obstruction. He's got enough to keep Raynaud busy till the next century," he said, thumbing through notes. "And the baronet?" I asked. "Manslaughter, if the courts are generous," Lestrade said grimly. "Murder, if not." Lottie stood to one side with Holmes, her hand nervously twisting the edge of her shawl. She glanced between the two carriages, her face unreadable. "I believed him," she whispered. "He said we were starting over." Holmes regarded her. People often lie best when they think they're telling the truth. The constables sealed both carriages. As they rolled off down the lane, Holmes turned his back on them without a word. I could not help but notice that he did not look after them, not even once. We walked in silence through the orchard path. The early sunlight glinted across the leaves, and the world seemed too gentle for the truths we had unearthed. At last I said, "You've seen many crimes, Holmes, but this one, I think, struck deeper than most." He paused. "No, Watson," he replied. "This one simply struck where the veneer was thinnest." I saw him glance toward the cellar steps. Then he looked away. Back at Baker Street, the fire was low and Holmes was unusually silent. He had declined his violin and ignored the Persian slipper altogether. Sure signs of disquiet. I sat opposite him, the paper open but unread in my lap. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked. "From the moment you saw the brooch." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the mantelpiece. The brooch, silver, ornate, unmistakably feminine, sat now beside the Stradivarius. "I suspected," he said at last, "but certainty is the death of curiosity. Better to let the facts seduce you slowly." "You laid a net wide enough for two birds," I said, "yet only one sang." He gave a faint smile. The other was never silent, merely listened too long to his own applause. "And Imogen?" He looked at me then, really looked, not with calculation, but something close to weariness. "She is beyond our reach," he said quietly, "but not, I think, beyond remembrance." A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter, its seal bright with red wax. Holmes accepted it without a word. He turned it in his hand once, twice, and smiled not with pleasure, but with that peculiar anticipation I had come to know too well. "A new game?" I asked. "Perhaps," he murmured, breaking the seal, "or the shadow of an old one." And with that, he vanished once more into silence. There are few moments in life when one knows, with certainty, that a curtain is about to rise on a hidden stage. Such was the sensation that crept over me as I stepped into the Maddock Library that morning. The heavy drapes admitted only slivers of light, and the scent of oiled wood and old vellum hung in the air, like the breath of some long-forgotten judge. Holmes stood near the hearth, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Seated before him were Sir Percival, pale and stiff with resentment, Renaud, cuffed but calm, and Lottie, visibly trembling but defiant. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, "and Miss Lottie, thank you for attending. I dislike theatrics, but some truths require formal witness." Lestrade leaned against the far bookcase, arms crossed, ever the watchdog. I took my place beside him, notebook in hand, though I knew I could never truly capture the machinery that was about to unfold. Holmes reached into his pocket and withdrew the brooch. "This," he said, "was never meant to be found again, but the earth, like conscience, rarely keeps silence forever." Sir Percival's jaw clenched, Renaud's eyes widened. Holmes turned to the table where he had arranged the ledger, the letter, and several discoloured items exhumed from the cellar. "The past," he said quietly, "is only buried by those who fear its testimony. Today it shall speak." And with that, he began. Holmes placed his palm gently on the battered ledger. "This book," he said, "records not merely household occurrences, but the ghost of an affair. Here, in ink faded by guilt and time, we find evidence of a liaison between Imogen Maddock and Julian Renaud's grandfather, Jean Renaud, a French officer turned deserter during the Napoleonic retreat." Sir Percival scoffed audibly, but Holmes raised a hand. "You may dispute the decency of it, but not the fact. The letter found within, written in Imogen's own hand, speaks of their intention to elope. She names the hour and place." He turned toward Renaud, whose mouth had parted slightly in disbelief. "You were seeking only closure, monsieur, but you brought with you the key to a lock long rusted shut. Your resemblance to your grandfather is more than passing. It is what stirred the memories and the guilt." Holmes turned once more to the brooch. Imogen's gift, a token exchanged in secret perhaps, one she wore even when she met her death. Lestrade looked up. "But why would it matter now?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Because theirs was a union that would have stained the Maddock name. She was noble, he, a deserter, worse still, a foreigner. A scandal that, if revealed, could have toppled not just Sir Percival's father, but the very reputation upon which this estate was built." He folded his hands. "That is the soil in which murder takes root. You see," Holmes continued, "Imogen never left of her own accord. She did not vanish into the wilds of scandal or shame. She was intercepted." Sir Percival said nothing, but the way his eyes fixed on the hearth told me the fire within him was no longer indignation, but memory. The confrontation took place not in the garden, as Lottie believed, but in the eastern corridor, beneath the arch, where the servants would not hear. She told him of her plans, of her love, of her departure, and he, Sir Percival, struck her. Lottie gasped. Renaud's hands clenched in his lap. "She fell," Holmes said, his voice now like a scalpel, precise and merciless. "Struck her head against the carved stair-post. Death was not planned, but once it came, the decision was made swiftly. She could not be allowed to bring disgrace." He turned toward the fireplace and gestured at the pile of charred fragments Lestrade had retrieved from the ashes. Her effects were burned, her story rewritten, letters destroyed, ledgers erased, except one. Renaud's voice, though quiet, broke the stillness. "And the brooch?" Holmes nodded. "Dropped, perhaps, or hidden in a moment of weakness, but certainly forgotten." He faced Sir Percival directly. "Had you not sealed her in lime, the bones would have spoken sooner. But time is rarely loyal to secrets. It corrodes even the most careful silences. Sir Percival made no reply. He merely reached for the brandy, his hands shaking. Holmes stepped back. The sin was not in the act, but in the belief it could be hidden. Holmes now turned to the final mystery. The 3 skeletons found beside Imogen's own, each clad in remnants of tattered blue and bearing insignia unfamiliar to English regiments. These men, he began, were not English at all. They were French deserters, men who abandoned the chaos of Bonaparte's retreat and sought sanctuary within Barcombe's forests. He gestured to the smallest of the skeletons, whose gold tooth had gleamed even in the dim light of the cellar. One of them, likely a smith by trade, assisted in repairs around the estate. The other 2 may have been no more than vagrants with uniforms, but what matters is that they saw something. Lestrade furrowed his brow. You think they witnessed the murder? Not Imogen's, Holmes replied, but another, committed many decades earlier. For you see, these bones date to 1812. That places the crime at the time of Sir Percival's grandfather, George Maddock. He let the name settle like dust. A man of tremendous pride and few scruples. It seems he offered the deserters a night's shelter, or perhaps employment, and when they saw what they should not, he silenced them. Lottie turned to me, whispering, "But why keep the bones?" "Because the Maddocks do not bury their shame where others might stumble upon it," I answered. "They store it beneath their foundations." Holmes folded his arms. In trying to erase one scandal, Sir Percival walked a path already trodden by blood, and in the corner, the dust seemed to shiver. Holmes now turned toward Reynaud with a curious softness in his voice, a rarity, and therefore notable. "You are not a thief by instinct, Monsieur Reynaud, nor are you a man who kills. You are, above all, a scholar, an historian of pigment and brushstroke, a man who sees meaning in varnish and the wear of frames." Reynaud gave a small, awkward nod, as if surprised to be described so truly. "It was you," Holmes continued, "who first noticed the frame in the Maddox study had been reframed with nails from a different period. French nails, used widely in the years following Napoleon's exile. It was you who identified the brooch as a regional design from the Rhone Valley, likely brought over by your grandfather himself." Lestrade grunted. "That still doesn't excuse breaking into the study." Holmes waved a hand. "Curiosity, Inspector, has been the prelude to more revolutions than rage. Reynaud's exploration was unlawful, yes, but not malicious. He believed, I think, that Imogen may have lived, that a lie had been told, and that the art, like all true art, contained the original sin in its dust." Reynaud looked up then. "I only wanted to know why my grandfather never returned." Holmes inclined his head. "And now you know, though I dare say that truth, like pigment, fades more gently than grief." As for Lottie, she remained hunched beside the fireplace, hands clasped tightly in her lap. It was not fear precisely, but the dawning of comprehension, the slow disassembly of her certainty. "She loved him, you know," I whispered to Holmes. "I never doubted it," he replied. "Which is why she must be spared." He addressed the room. Miss Lottie bore witness to fragments, a brooch, a vanished ancestor, the whispers of Imogen in childhood tales. But she was never privy to the ledger, nor the cellar, nor the bones. She was led, not leading. Sir Percival made a noise of contempt, but Lestrade raised a warning brow. "She aided Reynaud," the inspector noted. "Unwittingly," said Holmes. "He told her of art, of mystery, of love unfulfilled. She followed, that is all." Holmes turned to her. "You were nearly the final victim, Miss Lottie. Your belief in romance was nearly buried beneath another generation's shame." Lottie did not speak. A single tear tracked down her cheek, unnoticed. "She is innocent," Holmes said finally, "but innocence once nearly shattered seldom feels whole again." And in that moment, I pitied her more than anyone else in the room. "And now," Holmes said, his voice regaining its crispness, Let us address the question no one asked, but all felt. How did I know it was murder? He walked to the ledger once more and lifted a folded cloth. Upon it was a faint black stain, barely discernible. This, he said, is French lampblack, an artist's pigment of exceptional density and uncommon usage. It was found on the corner of Imogen's brooch. Raynaud leaned forward. It is used in oil priming, for canvas. Holmes nodded. Precisely. But the brooch had not touched canvas. It had touched only stone and dust, and something more recent. He turned to Lestrade. You will recall the scent in the cellar, the faint acridness beneath the lime. Lestrade nodded slowly. Something oily. Paint, I thought. Not paint. Lamp black. Which means someone opened the grave. Not in 1842. Recently, and not by accident. That smear told me two things. Someone had gone into the tomb to retrieve the brooch, and someone had failed to. I felt my skin prickle. And the decomposition? I asked. Holmes gave a tight smile. Too advanced for a recent death, but not consistent with others from the Napoleonic era. Imogen died in 1842. Her state told me she had been preserved unnaturally, in lime, which told me she had not wandered off, she had been hidden. He folded the cloth once more. Dust and chemistry, Watson, two of my oldest friends. As we left Barcombe House under a brittle grey sky, my thoughts swirled like the autumn leaves that danced along the gravel. I could not speak, not yet. The image of Imogen's brooch, the scent of ancient lime, the revelation of generations stained with silence, all haunted me more deeply than I cared to admit. Holmes walked beside me, silent as ever. At last I found words. You saw all of it, before anyone else had the faintest inkling. I still do not understand how. He looked ahead. You do, Watson. You simply hesitate to admit it. Because the conclusion offends the heart. I frowned. What do you mean? That a man would murder his own cousin for the sake of a family name? That a girl would nearly die from a story she never lived? That history, when buried, rots? I shook my head. Still, I marvel at your clarity. How you traced pigment to motive, bones to betrayal. You make it look so obvious, he finished. Only to those who care to look. I glanced at him. His eyes remained fixed forward. We reached the gate, and just before passing into the road, Holmes paused. You know, Watson, he said, skeletons are only ever silent to the unobservant. And with that, he stepped forward, leaving me to follow, as always, in the tracks of his reason. The train from Sussex returned us to Baker Street on a dusky afternoon, veiled in soot and drizzle, the very sort of weather that seemed to rouse Holmes from philosophical indifference to professional purpose. As the familiar landmarks of Marylebone re-emerged from the grey, I felt the weight of the Barcombe affair begin to loosen its grip upon my mind. There is a curious solace in London's sameness. The clip of hooves, the cry of the newsboys, and the distant thunder of industry murmuring like a hymn to routine. Holmes said little during the journey, choosing instead to occupy himself with the notes he had scrawled in a curious shorthand I never did manage to decipher. Once within the warm clutter of our rooms, he lit his pipe and stretched upon the settee, eyes closed, as if no more need be done. Back to the world, I said softly. Holmes replied only with a contented hum. The case closed, at least for now. Later that evening, as I penned the final lines of my account, I ventured a thought that had been troubling me since our departure. Do you suppose, I asked, that Miss Imogen's soul may finally rest now that the truth has emerged? That in some way, justice, however delayed, releases the dead from silence? Holmes, who had been tuning his violin with an absent-minded air, gave a faint snort. My dear Watson, he said, the dead care little for justice. They are beyond affront and absolution alike. It is the living who require stories to make sense of suffering. Ghosts exist to soothe conscience, not to reveal truth. And yet, I persisted, there is something deeply human in believing her spirit found peace. Perhaps, he allowed, but I shall reserve my faith for fingerprints, timepieces, and the tensile strength of a locket clasp. I smiled then. You are a most unromantic fellow, Holmes. On the contrary, he murmured, I am a romantic of reason. After a silence, Holmes rose and moved to his coat. From an inner pocket, he drew forth the brooch, Imogen Maddox's brooch, the one found clenched in her skeletal hand beneath centuries of stone and gilt. He regarded it for a long while, turning it slowly between his fingers, the dying firelight catching the faint gleam of its worn setting. Without a word, he crossed the room and placed it carefully upon the mantelpiece, beside the Persian slipper and the meerschaum pipe. It was a place reserved for oddities, tokens of old puzzles, usually filed and forgotten. But this he did not forget. His eyes lingered, not with sentiment, but with the curiosity of a man observing the residue of a chemical experiment, one whose conclusion surprised even him. I thought you were above such keepsakes, I said quietly. Holmes did not look at me. Even dust, he said, may crystallize meaning under pressure. The moment hung suspended, heavy, with the kind of stillness that falls after revelation, neither relief nor unrest, but something liminal between the two. It was then that a sharp knock echoed through the hallway below. Mrs. Hudson's muted footfalls followed, then the creak of the stairs. A visitor, I remarked, rising half-heartedly from my chair. Holmes, however, had already turned his head, nostrils flaring, as if the knock itself conveyed some nuance worth decoding. A moment later, our landlady entered with a puzzled frown and a folded letter resting upon a silver tray. "For Mr. Holmes," she announced. "Delivered by hand. The gentleman wouldn't give a name." Holmes took the envelope and held it to the light. The wax seal bore the unmistakable insignia of the Russian consulate, an imperial crest pressed in crimson. "Curious," he murmured. I leaned forward. "A new case?" "Perhaps," he said, eyes glittering. "And from Moscow, no less." Holmes slit the wax with a flick of his penknife and unfolded the thick parchment within. His eyes moved swiftly over the contents, and slowly, a familiar light began to rekindle behind their grey veil, a mixture of calculation and delight, of anticipation and cold intrigue. He refolded the letter with care and set it beside the brooch on the mantelpiece, as though one relic now called to another. "Well, Watson," he said, reaching for his coat, "shall we see what Moscow wants?" And with that, the fog outside our window no longer seemed quite so ordinary. As we settled once more by the fire in Baker Street, I turned to Holmes, still shaken by the unravelling of the Maddock affair. "It was not the horror of the act, Holmes," I murmured, "but the quiet precision of it. How could one so coldly preserve a secret beneath centuries of dust?" Holmes, gazing into the flickering coals, replied without looking at me. "Because, Watson, the most dangerous truths are not those shouted in rage, but those embalmed in silence." He tapped the brooch gently on the mantelpiece. "The dead do not speak, but they leave their arrangements." What do you think was the real key to the case? Was it the stain, the ledger, or the silence between two generations? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy unravelling mysteries with us, do subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes investigations and share this story with those who appreciate a good enigma.